On behalf of my fellow queer gay men doing research in Canada, I'm delighted to be able to present to you today. I'm presenting on behalf of the research team of the Imagine Men's Health study, basically what I'm focusing on is an examination of the level of masculinity ascribed to one's sexual role and its relationship to HIV sexual risk behaviors among gay and bisexual men of color in Toronto, Ontario, the shortest title in the program. The study is basically a community-based research study that was designed to examine body image and its relationship to health and wellness, including sexual health and wellness among gay and bisexual men of color. Pretty much most of what we know about body image is about American white middle-class women. We have a little bit of information about men. We have even a much smaller bit of information about gay and bisexual men, and very, very little information about gay and bisexual men of color. And that's why the overall study was conducted, to look at this issue for gay and bisexual men of color in Toronto. I just want to acknowledge the funding of the study through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and partial funding also through the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. Thanks. This is the research team. What you'll notice about the research team is a little chunk of that team. About half of the team are academics and the other half are community providers. And we also have a very large and extensive community advisory committee as part of this study. It certainly doesn't make sense for me as a white male academic from the United States in Canada to be conducting a research study on gay and bisexual men of color without an active, engaged community process. And logos are pretty. People work hard on those logos. So the study background is it's a multi-phase mixed method study. I'm not going to report anything on the focus groups and interviews we conducted, but on a little piece of analysis on masculinity and HIV risk among the survey participants. I want to mention that, of course, the way we categorize and understand race and racial categories is very different in many contexts. In Canada, in Toronto in particular, these are the 4 communities that are the largest non-white ethno-racial communities in Toronto. East and Southeast Asian men, Black, African and Caribbean men, Hispanic, Latino, Brazilian men, and South Asian men. I'll be glad to talk to people about that afterwards if it's helpful. To take the survey and to be in the study, one needed to be 18 years of age, identify as gay or bisexual, report having had sex with another guy in the last year, and identify with at least one of the 4 ethno-racial communities and be able to take the survey, which was in English. We did the data collection through fluid surveys. About 920 guys started the survey, which is pretty remarkable. And we had a completion rate of, about 410. This analysis reduced down to 369, but a completion rate of 44%. Recruitment was done through these various means, but one of the important components of our recruitment was essentially popular opinion leaders, guys who were very particularly connected in each of these ethno-racial queer communities, who were able, interested, and engaged with the study, who helped to recruit folks to participate in the survey. This slide is out of order, but that just makes sure that you're all awake, including me. But basically, previous research that's looked at masculinity in relationship to sexual risk has shown that there has been some association. However, this is primarily among gay and bisexual men, but it's primarily based on white samples. And so little is known about how this level of masculinity ascribed to one's sexual role is associated with sexual risk among gay and bisexual men of color. And that was the purpose of this study, was to examine the relationship between the level of masculinity ascribed to one's sexual role, demographics, and HIV sexual risk among a sample of gay and bisexual men. Basically the measures we had were demographics questionnaire. We used a subscale of the perceived masculinity scale from Cheeseborough and Fuse, the subjective gender identity subscale. And we also asked extensive questions about sexual behavior, including occurrence and frequency of pretty much any kind of sexual behavior you can imagine. What we focused on as our dependent variable here is serodiscordant condomless anal intercourse. using SPSS 21 and some magic of statistics. I just want to highlight the gender identity subscale so people have a sense of it. Essentially what it's looking at is on a scale of 1 to 7, how you would rate yourself in relationship to your sexual role on a scale of masculinity. Rate yourself, how you think your friends might rate you, how you think strangers might rate you, and how you think that your intimate sexual partners might rate you, from a low of 1 to a 7 of high. Our sexual risk behaviors questionnaire, what we focused on specifically was we did have participants' HIV status, and we stratified that in conjunction with the reported sexual HIV status of their sexual partners. So in the past 6 months, how often if people reported that they had condomless, any of these 4 behaviors among another of other behaviors, with HIV positive male sexual partners, HIV negative male sexual partners, and those whose status was unknown. And sexual risk was categorized as serodiscordant condomless anal sex with a primary partner, and any condomless sex with condomless anal sex with any secondary partners. And so we did essentially 3 models looking at those who reported exclusively receptive, exclusively insertive, and overall people who reported both. A little bit about the sample. The numbers in terms of racial identity categories are relatively similar based on our recruitment strategy. About 98% of the sample identified as gay or bisexual. The age range was relatively diverse. And about nearly 70% of the sample were guys who were not born in Canada. And about half of the folks in the sample reported a bachelor's degree or higher. 17% were HIV positive, and about 8% of the sample were unsure of their HIV status. So in our logistic regression modeling, the only model that was significant was for those guys who reported insertive only sex, so for the tops, so the up-overs as opposed to the down-unders. I'm not sure what that means about the relationship with Australia and Canada, but we can discuss that later. Gladly. The final model accounted for about 20% of the variance. The other 2 models were not significant, so I'm not reporting them here, but I'm happy to talk to anyone about them. Essentially what the final results from this showed that income, which is often associated with sexual risk, was significant for those folks with the lowest level of income were 2.5 times more likely to report sexual risk than those with the highest level of income. HIV status was also significant in that those folks who were HIV positive in comparison to those who were HIV negative were more than 3 times more likely to report risk, and those whose HIV status was unknown were nearly 5 times more likely to report risk than those who were HIV negative. In terms of the perceived masculinity scale, what you can see is the 1.06 near the bottom right there represents a 6% increase for each point on the scale. So it's a 7-point scale. So from the lowest to the highest, that could represent a 42% increase in risk in relationship to HIV risk based on someone's perceived sense of masculinity. Again, this is among men of color in Toronto, if I haven't said that enough. So some of the implications, it's important to note that level of masculinity attributed to sexual role and HIV status and income are associated with sexual risk for gay and bisexual men of color. I feel it's really important to acknowledge that in our search for scales and measures around measurements of masculinity was a nightmare because most of the measures of masculinity are very disturbingly homophobic and disturbingly misogynist, including with items such as I feel uncomfortable talking to a feminist. So if I score higher on that, then I'm somehow more masculine. Or I feel uncomfortable around feminine men or masculine women. So finding good scales for measurement of masculinity, and even whether we should, is a very interesting and important conversation. I do believe that further research is needed to better understand the link between masculinity ascribed to sexual role and sexual risk-taking for HIV and STI prevention among guys of color. I hope that these findings add another dimension to our HIV prevention, particularly among men of color in North America and Canada and Toronto, because it does suggest that gender roles and gender norms are maybe part of the mishmash of what is contributing to HIV risk among guys of color and gay and bisexual men. Thank you.